Aren't you going to kick this off? Oh, cool. Okay, well, Rebecca, I guess I'll just start in.
Sure, if you want. I skipped over the map section, but I didn't know if you wanted to do that one.
Oh, that's
map
not
for where everybody is located.
We've
Okay.
already seen in chats pretty much where people are from, so I think that will
true.
be fine.
Okay.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. And seeing as how we're all over, literally all over the map, I can't even say I wish you a good evening or a good morning or a good afternoon because it's going to be all over. And hopefully no one is staying up really late to hear this or waking up really early. However, if you did, I hope it's worth your while, and I hope I will do my best to make it worth your time. I probably have to beg your forgiveness, however, because I'm going to be framing this, at least initially, as kind of a brief professional history, because I think that will set us up for the points that I'm going to get to in the middle part of the presentation. So bear with me as I go through an abbreviated professional life story, if you will, to, again, kind of set the stage for some of the points I'm going to be making today. Also, please feel free to ask questions or make comments in the chat. I won't be monitoring that as I do my presentation, but we will be returning to it at the end for any further discussion or questions or what have you. So, but feel free to drop them in there at any time, and then we'll be sure to circle back and take a look at those. So, I've called myself the Forrest Gump of library tech, and this is not because I think libraries are like a box of chocolates. It's because I feel like in my professional life, I've touched on virtually every technology used in libraries in the last 40 years. So, you know, just like Forrest Gump, you know, basically was involved with almost every major thing that happened in the latter half of the 20th century, I feel like I've pretty much experienced the full gamut of library tech. So let me briefly go through what that is. When I was 16, my family moved back to Indiana, where I had been born and raised until 5, and in order to start an intentional community, also called a commune. And there I helped build 3 geodesic domes and the treehouse you see here, and spent a winter in that treehouse as well. And I was a high school dropout for reasons that are amusing but are outside the scope of this presentation, so you'll have to find me a drink sometime to find out that story. But anyway, since I had time on my hands back there in Indiana, which I thoroughly hated after living in California, I decided to begin volunteering at this place here. And this is the public library in Spencer, Indiana, which is the county seat of Owen County in southern Indiana. So I started volunteering here at 17 and continuing until I left, which was 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. So while I was here, I was introduced to the very first of the library technologies that I want to touch on, and that is something called library hand. And this is an example here of cursive writing, that a particular kind of cursive writing that was meant to be extremely clear and regular, and that was one of the initial technologies the libraries used. There's also an example of the next technology libraries used, which was the printed card or the typed card. So obviously the typewriter was a major technology innovation within libraries. And then even after that, the electric typewriter. This is actually a picture of virtually the very same typewriter that got me through college. So these things were still very much in use, of course, in the 1980s when I graduated from college. Then, as I mentioned, 2 weeks after my 18th birthday, I moved back to California with $500 in a duffel bag and ended up in a little town in the foothills of Sierra Nevada in California called Columbia. And Columbia has this college, Columbia College, a 2-year college. You could get various vocational degrees as well as lower division work. And I started working at the library here. So that was when I was obviously my late teens, early 20s. And I also, since there were rivers nearby, I also ended up being a commercial whitewater guide. So this is me when I was probably 21, 22. And then also ended up running the Colorado River through Grand Canyon half a dozen times. So that's really just an aside that I was doing other things besides learning about libraries. While I was at Columbia College, I made the acquaintance of this guy right here. Some of the older among you might remember the Commodore PET. This was one of the first personal computers that many of us had access to. There were, of course, other kinds of personal computers, but these were probably one of the most widely used at the time. This would have been in the early 80s. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a cassette tape that you can kind of see there on the lower left of this computer. And whatever you did was stored on the cassette tape. So as you can imagine, anything you did on this computer was extremely slow, almost agonizingly slow, because it had to spin the tape to read any data or your program or whatever off of this. This was my first introduction to programming, and I learned how to program in BASIC. And my very first program that actually functioned was a library orientation program for the library at Columbia College. So this would have been in like around 1982 or so. About that time, I decided I really wanted to pursue librarianship as a career. And so I needed to first get my bachelor's degree, which I didn't have, refer back to the fact that I was a high school dropout, so I had to take a test to get my high school equivalency and so on and so forth. So what I did was I then transferred or moved to Arcata in Northern California and went to Humboldt State University. And you can see how amazingly hairy I was at the time. And since I had already worked in libraries, I was able to get actually a staff position, a half-time staff position, and that's pretty much how I worked my way through college, was working at the library of wherever I was going to school. So at Humboldt, I made the acquaintance of this guy here. This is a PDP 1170, created by Digital Equipment Corporation, and I was an operator of this computer. And what this was for was running the circulation system of the Humboldt State Library. And I arrived just in time to assist in bringing up the library on automated circulation for the first time. And that was an amazing learning opportunity to make such a massive switch from basically a card-based system to a computer-based system. And that would be important later on as I moved on in my career, as you'll see shortly. This was right around 1983, 1984. So those of you who know your computer history know that the Macintosh was released in 1984. And Humboldt got some of these computers, so I was able to begin work on my first graphical user interface and started to begin to learn things like desktop publishing, which before that, desktop publishing was not even really possible. So it's kind of interesting to look back and see how far we've come in computer technology in just a few short decades. So after I got my bachelor's from Humboldt State, I went to UC Berkeley, to this building here. This is where the School of Library and Information Science was at UC Berkeley, South Hall. It's one of the only one of the few buildings left from the original 3 buildings of UC Berkeley. And that's also, of course, where I continued my acquaintance with another major library technology, which was the printed index. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember having to pour through volumes like this to find your citations, but that's what life was like, not that long ago. And of course, life was also like this, where we had card catalogs, and we had to, look up our books through these. Now, that was also the time when we were just beginning to get access to online databases. And that access was through these. This is called an acoustic coupler modem, where you would dial the number of the phone and put the handset into the modem, and the phone would send and receive the signal from the database. And this is also extremely slow, agonizingly slow, so much so that you'd sit there and you'd see individual characters kind of come across on the printouts. And this is how we search database vendors like Dialog in order to find information. But this is also the first real introduction to online searching. And this we did in library school and also at the UC Berkeley Library. Now, as we go into kind of the later part of the 80s, we got to beginning stages of the internet. So, we had a lot of what you call green screen kinds of devices and line mode access to, sites out on the web and so forth. There were actually bulletin board systems really were the first kinds of systems that we interacted with. After I graduated from library school, my first job was right there at UC Berkeley at the Moffitt Undergraduate Library. And this is a more recent picture of the library there. And since I had already had experience in bringing up an automated circulation system, I was able to parlay that experience into doing the same kind of thing for UC Berkeley. So in there, I was able to become the automation coordinator, is what they called it. And so I helped libraries on the Berkeley campus implement automated circulation, which was based on an in-house automated system called Gladys. So I would do the training, lead the barcoding projects, and all of that. And in those barcoding projects, we probably easily manually applied barcodes to 1 million books. So that was quite an undertaking, and it took quite a while to accomplish. Now, at the same time, the internet was progressing. There were a lot of bulletin board systems. Some of you might remember some of those old UUNet kinds of bulletin boards. They were quite clunky to use, but they were also amazing in the sense that they offered new kinds of interaction that just had not been possible the same way before. This is also the heyday of Gopher, which, in hindsight, it only lasted a few years, but it went from being nothing to being everywhere, just almost overnight. And this was, for a while at least, the primary way in which people could locate information on the internet. And this is a snapshot of the UC Berkeley Library Gopher, which I was involved in developing. And in fact, I have kind of a story about this in the sense that there was a time where we were trying to decide whether to go with Gopher or the web. And this was before graphical web clients. So we decided to go with Gopher because Gopher didn't require a lot of arcane markup, this thing called HTML. And it was still text-based, so there was no added benefit that we could see by going with the web. And then within probably 2 years, we deeply regretted that decision because then we were saddled with this old system, this Gopher system that we then had to migrate forward. But nonetheless, that was the world back then. Right about that time, I co-authored this book here, which was really the first book about the internet for librarians. This was in the fall of 1992, and it's also was what we based a training program on. So Ann Lippo, John Over, and myself all started doing training on how to use the internet around this time. And over the next number of years, around the same time, NCSA Mosaic came out, and this was in the summer of '93. And really, that was just world-changing. I mean, once you saw a graphical interface to this thing called the World Wide Web, we knew the world had changed. It had just completely changed our perspective on internet, what the internet could do for us. And we kind of saw that it was really going to be transformative. So I'm going to take, that's pretty much the story that I wanted to go through. And at this point, I want to kind of think about, what does all of this mean? I mean, what, having gone through that trajectory of all the way from printed cards to the web, that all happened in the space of what, about, no more than about 25 years. So it's just really astonishing the kinds of changes that we've seen in the profession over that period. But what does that mean? What is that? How do we boil that down and go forward? And that's what I want to kind of talk about now. One thing that I think is absolutely clear is you can never stop learning. Pretty much all of the technologies that I described required learning to be able to use them. And, obviously that didn't happen in school. It happens just on the job. So learning all the time is absolutely essential. The other thing is, we're not always good about predicting the future. So take the jetpack, for example. I mean, if you went back to an early popular science magazine, well, let's say a popular science magazine in, I don't know, the 50s or 60s or something, they were all predicting that we'd all be flying around in jetpacks in, 10, 20 years max. And here it is, 2014, and I still do not have my jetpack. So what's up with that? So the corollary to this is that we're not always good about predicting the future, so things we think are going to be happening soon may never happen. And then the flip side of that is things that we can't imagine happen. So, who would have predicted Google, for example, and its impact on our world? So that's one of the difficulties we're dealing with, is predicting the future is really darn difficult. The other thing is that although change is a constant, its pace is not. So whereas I would say the period of, say, the mid-'80s to the early '90s, so we're really only talking about, less than a decade, the pace of change was absolutely blistering. It was really transformative for libraries in a lot of ways. But if you take a 10-year period now, I think you would see the change is actually pretty slow in comparison. So we have periods that are quite revolutionary in nature, where change happens very rapidly, and then you have periods of relative stasis. And I think we're in one of those periods now. At least it feels that way to me, where the change within our institutions is slower, perhaps, than it has been at various times in the past. Also, I would say the change is unevenly distributed. So at the same time within libraries, we're basically moving everything to the web. This thing is basically unchanged. In other words, our bibliographic foundation really hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot. Now, that's in the process of changing, but, the MARC standard has been around for, quite a while, 50 years, and it's been changed around the edges. It hasn't been any kind of transformative change over that entire period. So those are some things to keep in mind then. And now I want to turn to, what do I do? If you're on board with some of the things that I've been saying, then what do I suggest you do with that? The first thing I suggest you do is you start with your mission. And I think, maybe that's a little startling to say because, I think we all kind of have a sense of what our mission is, but I want to explicitly talk about it. And I'm not the only one doing this. One of my favorite professionals is David Lankus, and he talks about this a lot. And his reply to my question, what is your mission, is pretty darn clear. It says the mission of librarians is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in their communities. Now, that's a great mission, and I can get behind that. But I also, when I started thinking about that some more, I really kind of wanted to boil it down. And so I ended up coming up with a different formulation that I like better, partly because it's much simpler. And for me, the mission of librarians is to empower. And I will, define that a little more for you in a minute. But there's also a blog post out there that talks a bit about this as well, and also cites David's definition as well. But what do I mean by empower? Well, let's take a look at this. Clearly, librarians empower individuals. In other words, we do all kinds of things that help individuals to learn, to gain new skills, perhaps even just to read. We do all those kinds of things all the time. So I think that's fairly clear. But we also empower organizations. Any company worth its salt likely has a library because they understand that if they're going to innovate, they need access to information. And still, the best way to get access to information that they need is through a library. So we empower organizations of which individuals are a part. We also clearly empower communities, and we do that in a variety of ways. Even something just as simple as, meeting room space or a common place where people can come, hear speakers, have meetings, what have you, as well as obviously providing information resources into those communities. And then, of course, society in general. I think it's widely acknowledged that you really can't have a democracy without free and open access to information, and libraries are really the primary mover of that and provider of that. So there are some specific ways in which we empower people, organizations, society. Obviously, increasing knowledge, that's a key piece that David Lankus touches on. We, of course, system skill development, provide access to tools. Those tools could be a variety of things, not just information tools. Libraries are increasingly providing access to things such as 3D printers, for example. And even, I know there's a library in Berkeley that actually is a tool library. You can actually go and borrow a hammer or something like that from the library. And then, of course, providing access to networks, not just the internet, but also networks of individuals and people as well. And something came through recently that I thought was quite interesting, and this was an Atlantic article about the Columbus Public Library in Ohio, and they had people describe the library that they had known, so the library in the past, and that's the word cloud up in the upper left. So they say words like books and research and quiet and reading, homework, education, information. And then they have them describe the library of today, and that's on the bottom right. And you'll notice it's words like community and technology and meeting and access and media, entertainment, internet, all kinds of other things as well. So I think people really are realizing that libraries have a lot to offer besides what we have traditionally offered, which I think is important. So after kind of focusing on mission, what is your overarching mission? I think the next thing to do is to focus on community, focus on who it is you're trying to serve. And obviously we all have different slices of that. So if you're an academic library, you're going to have a set of users at that institution. If you're a public library, it will be, your service area within your community. Those communities are going to have different constituents. So, for example, public library, obviously, story hour is going to be important, for kids. But then you also serve adults and youth and other slices who have different needs. So it's important to consider all of the various permutations of the community you serve and realize that they have different needs and requirements. And then, of course, folks like this, they're going to have completely different needs for information, and you're going to have to understand what those are, depending upon if they fit into your community. So in doing this, I would ask what I would call the key questions, which are, at least these are some of them. There's, of course, additional ones that you would need to consider. But the way I like to think about this is, what do they want to be able to do? How do they think about that? What words do they use to describe it? How do they naturally wish to work? So, if they're trying to find information, for example, how would they normally go about that, and how would they normally most easily understand what you're offering them and what you can do for them? What are some of the words that you can use to describe those things? And then how can we mold our services to be the way in which they naturally think? That may mean changing some things. It may be renaming some things so they recognize in their terminology what it is you're offering them. Those are some of the kinds of things you need to ask. Then, after kind of spending time with your mission and your communities, or the various slices of your community that you wish to serve and trying to understand them better, then you need to focus on yourself and your institution. There's a lot of ways that can happen and that you need to do. I thought it was really funny recently, just a couple of months ago, there were these deer that just crossed the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, it was just so astonishing, a happening that, it was the kind of thing where you would not have expected it at all, that you would run into these deer that are crossing a bridge. But I think people handle it quite well, and that's really what I'm suggesting here, is that be ready for anything. You're going to get some surprises, but don't let it bowl you over. Just, carry on and get it done. The other part about be ready for anything is preparation. So making sure that you've got the tools at hand that you need to be able to handle change effectively. And that might be things like acquiring new skills, or doing some reading outside of your normal things that you read. So there's a lot of things you can do around that. The other point I want to make is pretty much clearly your target population is not you. And by that I mean, even if they come from the same cultural background you come from and are the same, around the same age as you are, and, all of those things, they're still not a librarian. So don't assume that you know how they think about things and how they approach things and all of that. That's why, it goes back to the idea of focusing on your community. Who are these people? Really try to get to know them better than I think typically we do, because they are not us. They are different, and it's important to understand in what ways they are different. Okay, so we've reached the point of the gratuitous cat photo. So I think I can safely say that this is officially a library presentation, because now we've had a cat photo in here. So, and the point here, obviously, roll with the punches. You're going to have some times when you're stymied in some way, or you're, you have a board that is being difficult to work with, and you're just going to have to roll with that. Some personality traits. I'm a big fan of trying to hire staff based on personality traits rather than specific skills, because skills can be learned, traits mostly cannot. It's important to find people who really love to learn, because, I think you've seen, certainly within libraries over the last 30 or 40 years, that things change all the time and sometimes very rapidly. So you always have to be retooling yourself. This also requires flexibility. By this I mean, well, if you're doing exactly the job that's in your job description, that's probably going to last about 3 months. And then things are going to change, and they're going to morph, and they're going to, you're going to be called upon to do different things than what's in your job description, and that's generally speaking a good thing. You want to be flexible, you want to be able to move with the times and do what needs to be done, and that does require flexibility. Risk-taking is good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's stupid risk-taking. There's also taking calculated risks, and that's what's important, is to take calculated risks. I'm a public service librarian. Even though I've worked in technology for the vast majority of my career, I still call myself a public service librarian because I began in public service. I'm steeped in it. I think it's absolutely essential for all of us, whether you work at a front desk or not, to have a public service perspective, because that's who you're trying to serve. I think individuals who can actually help organizations change, to help foster change, are vital to our organizations, and we really need to have as many of those people around as we can, because change is, as I said before, constant. And certainly the ability to work together with others and also be self-motivated and be able to work independently is important. Now, after covering kind of these personality traits, I still can't ignore skills. So I'm just going to highlight just a few skills that I think you might want to consider. Certainly, excellent communication skills are really vital, and this crosses the board. Written, verbal, whatever. I also found that many of the things we end up doing in libraries ends up being a project of some kind, whether it's a software development project or whether it's a building renovation project or things like that. You generally have to manage a series of activities over a period of time, and doing that well is a skill, and that's an increasing importance in libraries these days. Obviously, we're in a soup of metadata standards, and it's important to kind of be aware of all of those and what they offer, the strengths and weaknesses, how they might work together, all those kind of aspects. And if you're technical, then you really need to know, things like XML and XSLT in order to be able to transform metadata into a variety of formats. I think all of us need kind of a general facility with web technologies, and by this, I mean somewhat of a high-level view of that. So, how to use content management systems, how to use a wiki, how to just use some of the tools of the web, and to not be scared about using any of those tools. I listed coding here, software coding, for a specific reason. And it's not that I think we all need to run out and write software. I don't think that's valid. But I do think it's an important knowledge to have just in general of what software coding does, what it can do, how relatively easy or difficult a given thing is to do in software, I think is an important thing to know. So in other words, I want librarians to be able to spot things that could be fixed with software, because often the fix is a lot easier than you might imagine. And you only know that when you know what it is to write a program. So I actually am a fan of all librarians, taking at least one software writing class. I don't care what language it is, just to get the concepts down of what it is to write a program, what it can do, and some of these things, so that later when you're managing the library and someone comes to you and says, oh, well, that's too difficult, or that would take 3 months to write the program to do that, you can say that's bullshit. I've coded before. I know you can do this inside of a couple days, so just do it. That kind of thing. It's important to have that knowledge, I think, since we're in an information business. So obviously, if you're going to be doing these things, you really need to be keeping up with the times and really trying to keep abreast of things. I often talk about learning as you breathe. And by that I mean, every day without even thinking about it, you're absorbing new stuff. It's not like you have to sit down at a specific time of the day and learn something new. It's more like you're picking stuff up just in the normal course of your day. And that's, I think, an important concept. Also a fan, since there's too much to keep track of out there, is you need to make strategic learning decisions. And by this I mean, I see this a lot in technology. So there's a new technology that pops up, and it may or may not be important to libraries, but you might want to take a look at it and see and ponder that question. Is that something that might be important now or maybe important later? And you might decide to ignore it for now, so that you can spend your time on something else which is more important. And then come back to that decision every now and then. If the technology is still around and seems to be gaining a foothold, then you can reassess. And if it's more important now or it might be more useful now, then you pay attention to it. But I'm a big fan of ignoring things that you don't think are going to be useful for you right now. Professional filters can be a lot of things. It could be individuals. So, you follow certain people on Twitter and you allow them to point out articles that they like or things that they're interested in, things that they see are increasingly important to libraries. It could be things like magazines and journals. It could be a lot of different things. But allow others who are knowledgeable to filter out the dreck and to point you to the important things. You can also just directly ask people who you trust. So, for example, if you know that someone is really up on a particular area, you can ask them, hey, what do I need to know about that thing that you know a lot about? Give me, 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Just, what do I need? What's the most important things I need to know about that? A huge fan of learning by doing, and I realize we all have different learning styles. But I think one of the ways in which learning sticks with us the best is when we actually do something with it. So I think it's important to seek out those opportunities that allow you to actually get your hands dirty in some way. We're all responsible for our own learning. No one else is. So we're responsible to make sure that we learn what we need to do to move forward and do our jobs well. And that means also taking the necessary time to do it. And that might mean blocking time out in your day. Of course, our institutions need to be more agile. There's various ways this can happen. Really big fan in trying to maximize communication, because I think that's very important in any organization to really have a free flow of information up and down the hierarchy and across. Also a fan of using task forces. Standing committees are really, really poor for actually getting things done. But standing committees can spawn task forces, which are given a specific charge, certain thing to do, a certain set of people who are the best people to do that thing, and then a sunset clause. That is, once you do this thing, you go away. And that's the best way organizationally to get actual work done, because then you can have anyone from the janitor to the university librarian on that task force. Various things we can take from a rapid development of software in terms of like not trying to get something perfect before we test it out, but to just continue to improve it. So get it out there. This could be a service. It could be something you want to test to see if there's enough interest. And then if it turns out there is enough interest and people are responding to it, then you put more effort into it and you shine it up. But I think too often we think that things must be absolutely perfect before we throw them out there and try them out. And that's damage. That's really not a good way to do things. And then, of course, we have to be ready to kill things off if it turns out that they don't work out. We're coming into well, we're in a period, obviously, when there are no permanent parts to anything we do. Things can change, and they do all the time. So that means monitoring your environment, building for constant change. That means, for example, maybe not making sure everything is perfect, but doing the minimum you can to actually go ahead with something that is going to change a week, a month, a year down the road. Don't think your job description is prescriptive. It's just broadly definitional, but it can change. What you do day to day can certainly change, and it should. Of course, we're all responsible for our own professional development, and that is because whatever we know now is likely not going to be what we need to know tomorrow or the next day. Do try to look out for what the next big thing is, but don't just jump on board just because it's shiny. But as you see it's gaining traction, then you can do some things probably to prepare for it. And what are some of those things that you can do to prepare? Well, make sure the people you're working with know about it and know about it early and hear about it often. You can invite their participation in ways in which they can imagine how their jobs will be different or some new opportunities that they might have. There may be someone who's willing to step up and be a champion for the change, and that's fine too. That can really help. And then they may need to provide the space and time for that innovation to either crash and burn or be successful. And then you need to figure out what the deal is. Do you give it a certain amount of time to either get to a certain point of success, or you decide you're going to pull the plug. And that's kind of the nature of trying things out and going forward. So to circle back to the story that I began with, it's kind of interesting to realize that now at OCLC Research, I'm working on a 41-node compute cluster, which, as you can see there, has over a terabyte of RAM and a quarter of a petabyte of disk space on it. We're doing parallel processing of massive data sets, and this kind of processing power would have been absolutely inconceivable to me back in the day when I was working on this machine here. And it's also kind of astonishing to think that we all walk around with a device in our pocket which is more powerful than the computer that allowed us to put a man on the moon. And we now just take this for granted. And this has just been the last 30 to 40 years that all of this that I've described, every single bit of it has happened. So it seems clear to me that the strategy for being a 21st century librarian is really to be prepared for absolutely anything. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And we've got actually a good slice of time here to talk about your questions or comments or things that you might want me to say a few more words about. So I'm going to turn to the chat now and ask also Rebecca if she has anything she wants to pose to me immediately. And I'll start looking at these chat comments.
I don't see any open questions from the chat so far.
Okay, feel free to drop things in there, anyone really. Well, I see at least someone used a Commodore 64. Yeah, a couple of people. Oh, Graham used an Apple. Yeah. Okay, so no one has any questions or comments or requests for
It looks like
additional,
Nellie TM posted something at 3:45. It said, "Does your library use event management? And if so, what program?"
yeah, I think that probably was to the entire room. So if anyone wants to answer that for your situation, please go ahead and do so. You know, I don't actually work in a library per se, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that specific question. How do you think that Rosie asks, how do you think the libraries that deal with a lot of turnover can ensure an effective use of technology? Well, actually, I think a library that sees a lot of turnover actually has an awesome opportunity to deal with, to ensure effective use of technology, because that gives you lots of opportunities along the way to hire in folks who might be useful in implementing that technology. I realize you may be thinking of having to like retrain people in a particular technology, but I find that staff who have been around the longest are often the most difficult to train. And if you can hire new people in, then you can kind of set the expectations right from the get-go that they're going to be expected to learn this, or even just hire in someone who already has experience with that technology. Anna asks, what do you think is the next big thing coming down the pipe for library tech? Linked data. Well, certainly I'm steeped right now in the linked data world, and you know, I'm tempted to say that. However, you know, if we do linked data effectively, then it's going to be under the table. It's not going to be something you specifically see. What you will see are interfaces that just work better. So in other words, when cataloging, you might, when you get to the point of putting in the author, the cataloging tool might go out and query a linked data store and fetch back an identifier for that author that you can then put in the record. But it's not like you're going to be hand coding or trying to interpret linked data. It would just be part of the plumbing in the systems. So, but I do think it is coming, and but it will be a little while before we have systems that actually exploit it. What are some of the specific sources used to keep current? Yeah, that's a really good question. Some of my favorite sources, actually, one of my favorites right now is Bloomberg Business Week. And I say that because I think it's very important for librarians to keep an eye on just the general environment. And the general environment is the kind of thing that a magazine like Bloomberg Business Week reports on a regular basis. So that kind of gets me out of my library shell and into a new space that I think is important to keep tabs on. Also, this is my opportunity to plug Current Sites, which is a current awareness publication that I've been involved with for nearly 25 years. And we publish monthly, and we just write a one-paragraph description of articles that we like. There's usually only about a half a dozen or so each month, but that can be a good way to keep current. And then also, lastly, Twitter. I mean, I actually now rely on Twitter to keep me up. And what I do there is I just, follow people who I admire and I think do a good job of tracking new things. And then whatever comes through my Twitter feed, that's kind of what I rely on. I used to be using a blog aggregator, but now I just rely on Twitter to get me to articles that are interesting or news that's interesting. Well, thanks, Jenny, for saying Current Sites is cool. I haven't heard of SCIS, I don't think. I'm just trying to look at it now, see what it is. It's taking a bit to load here. Oh, School Catalog Information Service. Oh, interesting. Aims to provide schools with access to a database of consistent catalog records. Oh, okay. Cool. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay,
Roy?
well, thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Excuse me, I have a question, actually. I was wondering, what was the middle? You gave a site in the middle. You said Twitter, Bloomberg, Business Week, and what was the thing about reviewing articles?
Oh, current sites? I'll just post it here.
Thank you.
Okay, we're almost out of time. It looks like we're out of questions. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it, and appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend it with me.